I am Nicole Mundy, and I am sitting here with my grandfather, Ed Wright, at an on-campus honors house at Hastings College in Hastings, Nebraska. It is 5:45 p.m. on November 5th, and we are going to discuss his experiences during the Vietnam War. We are going to start with some biographical questions. First, where were you born?
I was born on a farm, Route 1, Miami, Oklahoma. It was just across the Missouri border, about 4 miles into Oklahoma.
Okay, and is that where you grew up as well?
No, when I was about 2 months old, my mom and dad loaded me up and headed for California. We stopped off in Glendale, Arizona on the way, and they worked and picked watermelons and cantaloupes and got enough money to make it go over into the San Joaquin Valley, California. That's where I was raised.
Okay. Who were your parents?
My parents were Bill and Anna Wright.
Okay. How many siblings do you have?
One brother, he's 14 months younger than I. We made it to California the first time. My mom and dad made it back to Oklahoma in time for my brother to be born 14 months later. And then after he was born, back to California.
Okay. How would you describe your childhood?
My brother and I were raised in a small, I don't know, it's almost like a farm labor camp, but it was a small town. Had a post office and a barber shop and several bars. And that was about it. We went to elementary school there, and my mom and dad were busy working, and my brother and I, they raised us there. Very peaceful. And we had about 3 acres, and we had a big lawn and a lot of kids in the neighborhood. And we were probably poor, but we didn't know it. We didn't have a lot of money, picking fruit and stuff like that. And then my dad joined the AFL-CIO Laborers Union, and he's began working on construction and did very well. And we were raised very comfortably. Had a great, many friends, had lots of cousins and aunts and uncles around, and my grandmother on my mom's side lived nearby, and we just had a great childhood, raised in the San Joaquin Valley in California.
Okay. And if you were always outside, especially on the farm camp, were you ever playing games? And if you were, what were you playing?
Oh yeah, we played lots of games. We played, at that time on TV, it was all Western shows, cowboys and Indians. So we pretended and played a lot of cowboys and Indians. My family was religious, very devout, and went to church regularly. And so my cousins and my brother and I, we played church and pretended to play instruments and do all the things that we saw at church. And we played a lot of hide and seek. I recall a barn, a hay barn, and we would all play games in the hay barn, hide and seek and everything like that, all the kid games. We rode our bikes, and but a lot of organized games. We started playing baseball real early too. We'd go down to the park or to the school and play baseball, and we started a lifelong joy of being a baseball fan.
All right. As we transfer over to the time prior to any awareness of the Vietnam War, What were you doing before the war started?
Well, I can remember in 10th grade a debate in our class, and I was picked to defend Richard Nixon, and he was running against John F. Kennedy. And at that time, there wasn't much mention of the war. But after John F. Kennedy won the election, or they determined he did, there was questions about some of the counts. But after he was sworn in, and he sent several hundred, I'd say 300-400 advisors to South Vietnam. But the public didn't know much about it. I was always a news junkie, and read the paper. We got the paper every day and listened to the radio mostly. But there was always rumblings about all these advisors that he had sent to South Vietnam. But at that time, people hadn't made up their mind about whether we would go to war in South Vietnam or not. What they were worried about was the communists trying to take over these countries in Southeast Asia. When I was a kid, Eisenhower was the president when I was growing up. Ike was the president, and it was peaceful. We didn't. Then in 52 and 3, long in there, the Korean War broke out, and it was all about communists. The communists trying to take over, and it was communist China that everybody feared, and the Russians. And but the Vietnam War wasn't discussed much until about my senior year in high school or freshman year in college. At that time, I was a freshman in college when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. I remember my lab partner in zoology class come running in one day and said the president had been shot. And the professor turned on the radio, and we listened to the account about John F. Kennedy being shot in Dallas. And we sat there for a couple hours and listened to the radio until they declared that he had been killed and that Lyndon Johnson was going to be sworn in as president. And it was Lyndon Johnson that really got us into war. And by then I was a freshman in college.
Okay, do you remember a specific moment of what you were doing when you realized they were going to start drafting people to the Vietnam? Over to Vietnam?
When I turned 18 and I had to register for the draft, that was kind of sobering, because by that time, President Johnson had sent lots of troops into South Vietnam to keep the communists from taking it. And when I registered for the draft, they assured us that students probably wouldn't be drafted because we were classified 2S. And so when I got my draft card, when you turned 18, you register, then you got a draft card. And mine was 2S. So I thought I was going to be pretty safe to get through college. I started college when I was 17. So I had skipped kindergarten, and so I graduated. I was pretty young, and I started college when I was 17. So when I turned 18 and got a 2S classification, I thought I was going to be safe. But there were all kind of stories going around at that time in colleges about who was safe and who was going to be drafted, and how you could keep from being drafted, and all those kinds of things.
You mentioned that you were classified as a 2S. Does that mean anything specific, or what were the other classes?
You could be 2S, then you could be a conscientious objector, which means that you didn't believe in war. And I don't remember what that was, that classification. But the other, if you got to be 1A, then you were eligible for the draft, and would probably be getting a notice first to take your physical. And then as soon as you took your physical and you passed, then you could expect to be drafted in a month or so.
Okay.
But 1A was the one you wanted to avoid, because college students 1A were, you were dead meat. They were going to draft you.
When you heard that, what happened to you when you went to your physical? Because you were deferred, so what was the story behind you being deferred?
Well, I got through my sophomore and junior year, and the week before my senior year, I married another student at college. So we got married Labor Day weekend, just before our senior year in college. I was still classified 2S. However, that didn't last long, because President Johnson was sending so many soldiers to Vietnam. They ran out of 1As, so they reclassified a lot of college students 1A to fill up the numbers that they needed. So I got changed to 1A, even though I had got married. So then I got my notice to take my physical. My draft board was from California, where I lived. But I was going to college in Missouri. So they sent me with all the draftees from Missouri to Kansas City by bus to take your physical. I boarded the bus in Springfield, Missouri, and they bussed us up to Kansas City. And there were about 600 of us probably in the armory for our physicals one day. And I don't know if you want me to explain what went on or how I went through that or not, but I was there 3 days and 2 nights.
Okay, when did you pass your physical, and what happened after you took your physical?
Well, we were there, and what they did was, when you first went in, you stripped down, and they weighed you. And they give you about the physical papers. There was 3 or 4 pages all stapled together, and they handed you that and you put your name on it and your social security number, and they weighed you, and they put that on there. They give you a paper sack, a lunch bag, and you put your wallet and your watch or whatever, your valuables in it. And you carried that, and that's all you had. with your physical papers. Okay?
Okay.
So there's about 600 of us, no clothes on, in this big armory. It's probably 3 stories. And they had tape lines on the floor to different stations, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you just followed the line. And at each station, they checked something out on you. One of them was you had to give a urine specimen. One of them, they did eyes, ears, nose, and throat. One of them was, check your feet and things like that. And you went through 10 of them. The thing was, with so many taken in the physical at the same time, nobody ever touched you. It was just a sham, the whole thing. He would say, everybody look to the right, and then he would walk about 10 or 12 feet from you, walk down the whole line, turn left, look the other way, so you look the other way, he walked back to the other end. He said everybody passed. And they just went through that. The only thing that they, the whole physical that they told me was, I was a tall, skinny kid. I was short and skinny till about 9th grade. And then I grew about a foot. So I was 6'2", but I only weighed about 139 pounds, I think. So I was a tall, skinny guy. And they told me I was 9 pounds underweight. So they yelled at me and told me, get in another line. So I got in another line, and you work your way up. And a guy sitting there, a sergeant, at a card table, just a card table. And he looked at me and he asked me how old I was. And I told him. And he said, you passed. He said, go eat some bananas. You'll get over it. You'll gain some weight. And so I said, okay. So he grabbed my papers and put passed on it. And that's the only interaction with anything that they ever talked to you or touched you or anything if there was something wrong with you. Several kids in there taking their physical claimed they had this and that and the other. And that day, the only thing I saw that they let a kid, they didn't pass him, was he had a heart murmur. He had a rheumatic fever when he was a kid. And he had a heart murmur, and they failed him. Everybody else passed. It didn't matter what was the matter with you. Colorblind test, eyes chart, all that, they didn't. I mean, you look at it, and it didn't matter what you said, you passed. And then we did a mental test. We went in and you sat down and you had a booklet, and you had to write, answers to all these math questions and that kind of thing. And it was so simple that probably a 2nd grader could have done it. It was like, if your lunch, your sandwich cost $0.25 and your drink cost 10 cents, how much did your lunch cost? It was stuff like that. And if pencils are a nickel, how many would 3 of them cost? And even some of the guys flunked it just on purpose. And they went and made them take it again and warned them that if they didn't try, to answer questions, that they would just swear them in right there on the spot. They had the guy over there and raise your right hand, and you took an oath, and you were in the army. So the kids were trying to flunk all different things, like the eye chart. They would just read crazy answers and that kind of thing. They weren't taking it very seriously because they didn't want to pass the physical.
Dang. How did you end up being deferred and not enlisted in the war? How did you?
Well, right after I took my physical and passed, I went back home. They bussed you back to Springfield, whole busload of us. And I told my wife, Liz, I said, I passed. And so I'll probably get drafted. Well, it was my senior year, and I began student teaching. I was student teaching English at a it was a junior, senior high school. And I was student teaching, and I had to student teach 6 weeks, and then I graduated. It was second semester of my senior year. So I just went about life like, normal, and started student teaching. And right in the middle of it, I got my draft notice. I was to report to Fort Ord, California, which was, my draft board was from California. And so I called them and appealed and explained that I had already started second semester and paid, my tuition and everything, and that I was student teaching, and that I needed a deferment until June 1st or May 31st, as soon as I graduated. I said, I would be eligible. And after a couple of days, I heard back, and they give me that deferment until I graduated. And I asked them to give it to me in writing because I didn't want an MP showing up at the door and hauling me off, So they did. They gave me a letter that said that my draft notice was null and void, and I was deferred then until I graduated. So I finished student teaching, and I graduated, and there was a teacher shortage at that time. This was 1966, 67, and a lot of teacher shortages. So there were recruiters coming to college every day begging people to teach school, from all over the country, from all different states. And so I would go in, they'd sign in, and you listen to their spiel or watch their movie or something like that, And they would talk to you and ask you what your major was and that kind of thing. And I was secondary English, and I had a journalism minor, newspaper and yearbook. I was sports editor of the college newspaper and yearbook. So I had journalism English. And so one day I was working at a store at night. Being married, I needed extra income. So I was working at a store. And one day I came home for lunch, and my wife Liz said, "Do you know anybody from Michigan? You got a call today from Michigan wanting you." And they left a number. And I said, "I don't know anybody in Michigan. I have never been in Michigan in my life." And she said, "Well, I think it was a school." I said, "Wow, okay." So I called them back, and it was a school in Grand Blanc, Michigan, which was a suburb of Flint. And they needed an English teacher. And they said I had attended their recruiting visit at our school. And I said, "Yeah, I remember going and listening and watching the video." It was actually a 60mm film. I said, "Yeah, I remember watching that." And they talked to me for about, probably a half hour. Long distance in those days was really a feat. You only call long distance if somebody died or, there was something really special. But they talked to me for a long time, and before I hung up, they said, would I come up there and teach if they sent me a contract? And so I said, I wouldn't mind going up there and visiting. So I said, okay. So long story short, my wife and I took one or two other girls. I know one of them was from Oklahoma, and they wanted to go. They had places they wanted to visit in Michigan to teach school. So I drove up there and dropped these gals off at different towns, and we went up there and looked around. And all I remember about that trip is that it was stinking cold. Being a kid from California, I thought Michigan, was awfully cold.
Yeah. That's awesome. Now, from transferring from your time, from your awareness of the war to enlistment time, or for you, your deferment time, did you understand why the U.S. was involved in the Vietnam War prior to anything happening?
Yeah, because I was a journalism student in college, we had to read a daily newspaper, and we watched the NBC Nightly News with Huntley Brinkley, and I was a news junkie, and I know that the United States believed that in the domino theory, that if one country, whatever it was, small country, fell to the communists, it was like a domino. The next country would fall, and the next one, and the next one, and they would just take over. And they believed that Vietnam was the first domino. And then it would be Cambodia, Thailand, Korea, all those little, Burma, all those little countries in Southeast Asia. They would just fall one after the other to the communists. And Americans were big against communists. The Red Scare, they didn't want the communists to take over because they thought that they would eventually try to take over the whole world. And so I was aware of the big push to keep Vietnam from falling to the communists because of the domino theory. And technically, I was probably in favor of that theory. Growing up in the 50s with the Soviet Union, nobody wanted the communists to take over. And that was our big scare in those days. We just didn't want the commies, the red commies, to take over. So the thing about it was, there were people on the other side that didn't believe in that theory. They were against the war, and even in college there was quite a protest against the war from a lot of college students, college-age people, and that kind of thing.
So you mentioned that there were other people who were against the war, especially your college students or college friends. Were your family, your parents, and your brother against it, or did they have an opinion, or did you have any knowledge about that?
Yeah. Everybody had opinions about it because it affected so many families. I had a cousin, her husband was drafted and he was in the war. When I was in college, my wife's brother was drafted. He didn't take college very seriously and kind of fooled around, and they drafted him right out of college. So all of the everybody had relatives and family that were in Southeast Asia, whether it was Korea or Vietnam. And my family particularly was probably pro-war. If you, we were for the government. If the country needed you, you went. And most of my family was of that opinion. At that time, the big thing was if you were against the war and you got drafted, they went to Canada. They deserted and moved to Canada. And a lot of college-age students ended up in Canada to keep from going. They tried everything in the world to keep from going to Vietnam. All kind of draft dodgers. But our family was, pro for the government. If the U.S. needed you, you went. And eventually, I was drafted again, but I was already teaching in school, and my brother was drafted, and he served one full term during the Vietnam War. So my family was probably of the opinion that if duty called, you served. And I would have gone had the circumstances been, where I could have. First time I was drafted was I was student teaching. The second time I was drafted, I was teaching high school English in Grand Blanc, Michigan. And so they give me a deferment again to the end of the school year, and I never heard anything back from them.
So you never went?
Never went. I just, if they'd have drafted me in the summer or, something like that, they always drafted you right in the middle of the school year. And the superintendent of schools would get you deferred to the end of the school year. And the government, it's not very efficient. They didn't catch on, and they would wait till the next school year and draft you again.
Yeah.
So, but my brother went and served one full term.
So while you were teaching in Michigan during the Vietnam War, how did you learn about or receive information about the war while you were teaching? And did this change your perspective at all about the war?
Yeah, I watched the news every night, read the Flint Journal every day. We got the paper. But the high schools were very politically involved in those days. We weren't very far from Michigan State and from the University of Michigan, two large universities. And the big universities are where a lot of the protests were. I mean, it was massive protests from college students, tens of thousands of kids. And we weren't very far from those, and so that it would spill over into the high schools. I was a newspaper advisor, and all of a sudden, anti-war alternative newspapers, big stacks of them would appear in the bathrooms in the morning. Anti-war stuff. Mm-hmm. And so the kids would pick it up in the bathroom, and they were all reading it. And then the high schools would get bomb threats 3, 4, 5 times a day, and we would have to evacuate the building. And it got so that kids didn't have cell phones. There was 1 or 2 payphones in a hall down by the gym that you go down there and put a dime in and make a phone call. So kids would go down there and call in a bomb threat to the school. Or they would stay home and call. And nobody had caller ID or anything like that. But they finally got a system where they would rate the call as to the seriousness they thought it was real or not. So you'd get a code 1, 2, 3, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And if it was a certain code 4, let's say, you had to get out quickly. Otherwise, you just look around the room and see if there's anything unusual in the cupboards and that kind of thing, and just continue on. But I was doing graduate work for a master's degree at Michigan State, and they had riots over there almost every day, and broke out all the windows in the school. You know, they had plywood up everywhere, and then they spray painted graffiti on all the plywood. So, I went in the summer, 71, 72, right during the Vietnam War, and the summers were not quite as bad because most of the summer students were older. You know, they were teachers going to summer school and that kind of thing. So they weren't as many protests in the summer as there were during the school year. But Michigan and Michigan State, a lot of protests and parades and smoke bombs and bomb threats and taking over buildings and that kind of thing.
So you mentioned that you and your family were pro-war. If the country needed you, you went.
Mm-hmm.
And there were all these anti-war protests. Do you think you ever transferred to anti-war, or did you stay pro-war, or just go with the flow? And
no, we had bumper stickers that say "We support the troops," and as long as we had family and friends that were in Vietnam and Korea, we stayed pro-government. Yeah. I don't think we ever went to. The thing about the protests they weren't peaceful. They were violent. They burned down buildings and they occupied, you know, like the administration building, and they wouldn't leave that. And they'd fight the police. And of course, Kent State in Ohio, the National Guard went in there to clean it up and get them all out, and they end up shooting 2 or 3 students and killing them. And so, you know, it was just a crazy time. It was combined with the war protests, was combined with an era when pot and LSD and the other hallucinatory drugs become popular. So you're dealing with the druggies and then the protesters and the anti-war people and all that together. Plus, they had a presidential campaign, and all the anti-war people and students were against the government. The president and his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, they were all against them. And they would go to their rallies and just cause mayhem. So Johnson decided not to run it for re-election. And the protesters had a candidate, and it was just like Bernie Sanders in the current presidential race, but he was Eugene McCarthy. He was a senator from Wisconsin, and he was a pacifist, you know, no anti-war, and they were all for him, but there weren't enough of them to get him nominated, but they would turn out big for his rallies. Eugene McCarthy was their candidate, but nothing ever came of it.
so if there were protesters and it was violent with riots, how do you think the soldiers were treated? Do you know anything about that? And did the soldiers get proper care, to your knowledge?
No, they were treated terribly. The soldiers that came back from Vietnam, it was such an unpopular war that just figuratively speaking, they had to sneak back home. Nobody admitted that they were in Vietnam and all that. They weren't recognized for their service. They were, just harassed and that kind of thing. Not by their families that realized how important their service was, but by the general public. It was not a popular war. I tell you, the reason I think, as a journalism student, I think that it was so unpopular. It was the first war in the history of the United States that was played out every night in the nightly news. They kept a count of how many soldiers had been killed. And they would show their caskets being loaded on planes in Vietnam and unloaded at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, or Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. They would show them unloading all these caskets with flags on them. And every night in the news, they would keep count how many had been killed in the war, and all these caskets. And people hated, they turned against the war. They had reporters that were embedded in these groups of soldiers in Vietnam, and they filmed everything. They would, every night the war was on TV in color, and people just turned their stomach and hated the war. That was the first war that people just relived it every night, and it wasn't good.
Dang. If you could explain the war in one word, what would it be, and can you explain why you chose this one word?
Disaster. And I'll tell you why. The public wasn't behind it. And we find out that the military leaders were held back to keep us from winning. It made it impossible for us to win. And I think it probably was the first war in the history of the United States that we didn't win. When Barry Goldwater ran for president in '64 against Lyndon Johnson, they scared the public by saying that he would nuke them. He was going to just drop the A-bomb on them. And he may have. I thought it was cool. Anyway, but they wouldn't let us use the power of the military that we had from World War II and from Korea to go in there. And it was the first war where you didn't know who the enemy was. It was a jungle. You never saw them. They were hiding in caves and tunnels and booby-trapped everything. And, it wasn't a conventional war. It was a guerrilla war. It was the first guerrilla war. And the United States didn't know quite how to fight it. And it turned out to be a disaster. We barely made it out alive, and South Vietnam fell to the communists, and it's still communist to this day.
Jeez. If it was a disaster from your eyes, it was probably crazy for the veterans who were actually there.
Yeah, oh yeah. And I still know veterans from the Vietnam War, and they don't even talk about it. Now, more of them are beginning to wear hats that say Vietnam veteran on jackets and that kind of thing. And the big turnaround was the Vietnam War Memorial. When that was built, the Vietnam veterans all of a sudden felt important.
You said your brother served one full term over there. How did that affect you knowing that a family member was at war?
Well, I'll tell you, he was a good student. He was a math student. And he scored so high on his tests in the military, they sent him to special school. And he served the whole war here in the States in administration. He spent the war at Fort Carson in Colorado Springs, Colorado, in administration, and he never saw combat. He spent all 3 years running an office at Fort Carson.
I bet that was reassuring.
Yes, even though technically he was non-deployable, but practically he could have been sent over, but he just, I guess, did his job so well that they needed somebody to run the office there, and he did the job very well, and so they kept him there for the duration.
That's cool that your brother and your childhood play friend who played Cowboys and Indians with you, you both got to avoid combat.
Yeah. My brother and I were close and dressed as same, almost like twins when we were growing up. And he was always 1 year behind me in school. So when I went second grade, he started first grade, and then all the way through, he was 1 year behind me. Then I went to college in Missouri, and the next year, he came to that college and was my roommate then in college. And we were always just known as the Wright brothers, and if you saw one of us, you saw both of us. We were best friends, and we shared a car. We paid $300 for a '53 Ford and fixed it up and drove it to school after he came to school. So we had one car between us, and we just got along well. We had grown up together, and until I got married, then he was my best man.
That's awesome. Kind of backtracking a little bit here, what was your understanding of why the U.S. was involved in the Vietnam War?
My understanding is that President Kennedy sent advisors, and it may have even started earlier than that with President Eisenhower, but they sent some people over there, some soldiers and that kind of thing, to kind of advise the South Koreans, South Vietnamese, and they slowly sent more and more and got entangled in the war. And it was solely to keep the communists from taking over. And they were the big threat in the world at that time, the Red Chinese and the Soviet Union. In this case, it was the Red Chinese that were egging on Vietnam. And the Chinese controlled North Vietnam, and they wanted to draw a line in the sand, much as they had done in Korea. North Korea is still communist, and South Korea is free, and they was going to do the same thing in Vietnam. They drew the line, the North Korean, Ho Chi Minh, he ran it, and they tried to keep them from taking over South Korea, or South Vietnam. And That's how we got involved. They just kept sending more and more troops over, and finally we were in a full-scale war.
So even though you weren't in combat or deployed, could you tell me a specific experience from the Vietnam War era that you can't forget, or your most vivid memory of the time period?
Yeah. My brother-in-law got drafted. He was married and he had a little boy, about a year old. And he got drafted. He was a student and sent to Southeast Asia. Well, his wife was a student, and so my wife and I took her under our wing and helped her, and I would take care of the baby while the two ladies would shop for groceries and that kind of thing. And cute little kid, and everybody would come up and play with him, and they thought it was mine. We were seen so often together, and I would take care of him while his mom, and my wife would shop and take care of business and that kind of thing. And I thought it was ironic that the dad didn't get to see his little kid grow up for the first 3 years. That's one of the things about war. It separates families. And in this case, it was my brother-in-law. So I hated that the dad didn't get to see his little boy grow up for the first 3 years.
Well, the little boy was in safe hands for sure.
Yeah, but I don't think there's ever a substitute for your dad, especially if you get to know him first and then he disappears. And a 1-year-old doesn't understand that he's off at war and he's going to come back, or that kind of thing. But we did the best we could, and he did come home safely. His little boy was a lot bigger then than he was when he left.
Talking post-war now, what lessons did you learn that you would want others to remember about this time in history?
I think the thing that I would want people to understand is that you can disagree with what the government does and what the president and Congress does and that kind of thing, but burning down your own neighborhood or burning down your school or doing that kind of thing is just stupid, because it only hurts you. Mm-hmm. And there's other ways to get your point across. One, you can become politically active, and if you don't like the way the government's going, vote them out and vote in somebody that will change the course of history. And eventually that's what happened when Richard Nixon got elected. He put an end to the war pronto. And I went to a lot of the political rallies during those times. I had a press pass from college. And I would go, and I saw Barry Goldwater and Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, and I went to Richard Nixon rally one time, and different senators that were running for office, I would go to their rallies, and you just become politically active, and work to vote in other people. I never could see any reason to break out the windows at schools, colleges, or to set something on fire. It just never made any sense to me. And I think the ballot box is the most powerful weapon that people have to change the government.
That's crazy. Now, I'm really interested in this next question specifically because you said soldiers' homecomings were basically had to be under the radar and you had to kind of sneak home. Once the war was over, did life return to normal or were some things permanently changed?
On the surface, life seemed back to normal. I know that the country was gripped with prisoners of war. They had shot down a lot of our planes flying over North Vietnam, and they captured a lot of pilots and crew members and that kind of thing, and they kept them as prisoners of war and treated and tortured them and did everything. But Richard Nixon got him president, and he stopped everything, negotiated their release, and watching them come off the plane, helping, they were staggering and they were all bandaged up and that kind of thing, and one by one they'd come off the plane, and then some of them had been prisoners of war 6, 8, 10 years.
Dang.
And their families, some of them didn't know they were alive or not and that kind of thing, and they were all waiting out on the tarmac, and they'd come off the plane and you'd see family run out there. Kids hadn't seen their dad in 10 years and didn't know if they were alive, and they were, some of them barely alive. And people, I had tears in my eyes just watching them. It was pretty gripping. So, but life seemed to return to normal. But a lot of the soldiers had suffered terribly, and trying to get the VA to treat all these men that came home. Some of them had lost limbs and are blind and that kind of thing, and they seem to get treatment. It's the ones that had nightmares and post-traumatic, syndromes and those kind of things. Those, I don't think those soldiers ever probably got the full treatment that they needed. And there were tens of thousands of them. I mean, there were a lot of them. But most of them ended up, the families taking care of them. And people didn't talk about it.
Dang.
So things seem normal on the surface, but a lot of the men had problems that they were never treated accurately for.
So treating the soldiers differently from when they came home is one thing that could have been changed, but do you think anything else could have been done differently during the war? I know you had mentioned that the military leaders kept America from winning, but do you think anything else could have done differently throughout the war?
Yeah, we found out later that the President and the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, had misled the American people. They tell them one thing and they were actually doing something else. And so I think the big thing is if the government had come clean and just told the truth, here's what we're going to do, and here's why we're doing it, and here's how we're going to win, they would have been a lot different. But instead, they lied and misled the public. And a lot of people suspected that doesn't sound right kind of thing. Because if you ever look at Vietnam, what they would do, they wouldn't just come down the country, from North Vietnam. Mm-hmm. They would cross over and come down in Cambodia and Thailand. And then when they get down here, then they'd cut back into to keep them, well, the president said we weren't going to be involved with Cambodia and Thailand. They called it the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But we were bombing the crap out of them every night in Cambodia. And later on, I know that to be the truth because I was still teaching English, and kids from refugee camp that had been in refugee camps in Cambodia and Thailand would show up to class every day. They were, war kids, and they come to the United States by the hundreds, and they'd show up in your class two or three at a time, and you ask them where they were from, and they were a lot of them from Cambodia and Thailand, and not just Vietnam. And they'd bombed the crap out of them.
Slightly changing topics here, did you make any friendships through teaching or anything that continued after the war? Any friendships that continued after the war?
Well, yeah, family. My brother and brother-in-law, they both talk about the Vietnam War. I had a cousin, her husband was in the war, but we had friends at church. I was still involved in church that returned from the Vietnam War. And I found that the ones that had a great support group, whether it was family or like church or school, they seemed to return to normal, if I could use that term. They seemed to cope much better after the war than some that didn't have any support group to return to. And whether they didn't have that support group because people were against the war or they didn't seek help from support groups, but yeah, I still have a couple of teacher friends that fought in the Vietnam War and came back and started teaching again. And in fact, I still subbed for one guy that was in the Vietnam War, and I talk to him about it still. And things are a little different now because of the Vietnam War Memorial and other kind of things. The Desert Storm Wars and that kind of thing. Veterans are treated a lot better nowadays, including the Vietnam veterans.
That's awesome that you had an outside perspective of the war, especially being part of the press and everything, but you still weren't deployed. It's still cool that you were still quite involved with it.
Yeah.
With some follow-up questions here as we near the end, did you continue teaching ever since after the war ended?
Yes. I started teaching in 1967, September, and I taught all the way through the Vietnam War, and then I taught through the later wars in Iraq, and I retired in 2004, and I took a year after that. I didn't teach any. Then I decided to sub, and I substitute teach from 2005 to the present. I substituted even this past week, a couple of days. And every now and then I get into a history class and they ask me about, if I was around during the Vietnam War. And the funny thing is, I was teaching during Woodstock and that kind of thing. I kind of overlapped a lot of, important events, like the assassination of Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy was assassinated the second year I taught. They were both in 1968. And quite a few events.
Where did you teach and live after the war had ended?
I was still teaching in Michigan at the end of the war in '74, but shortly after, I moved to Iowa and taught school in Iowa. And that was a whole different experience because they were all farm kids. And the war had not touched them as much as urban kids in Michigan. Then I moved to Missouri, and the war protests were not as visible in Missouri. I was principal of a school there. And then in 1980, I moved to Colorado, and I've been in education ever since. But most of the Vietnam experience was in Michigan.
All right. When did you have your children after the war?
My first daughter was born in 1969, which was during the Vietnam War. In 1973, my son was born, right at the end of the Vietnam War, just before 1974, when Nixon became president.
All right. I think that is all the questions I have for you today. I appreciate your time and your knowledge on the Vietnam War. I'm glad you got to share your experiences with us. That is the end of the interview.
Well, I'm glad to talk about it. It's sometimes difficult to keep everything in perspective, but I think at my age, you can look back and draw some conclusions of what has happened in your lifetime, and it gives you a little different perspective than while you're living through it at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, unless you have any questions or anything else to add, I think that's it.
Thank you.